entering a realm between the hidden and forgotten, a slipstream caught between realities, a secret museum of the esoteric, the private library of shadows, all taking place in a world forged from mystery and caught between logic and myth. You are entering ParaReality.
Good evening, seekers of the strange and the unexplained. Welcome to ParaReality, a place where shadows whisper, mysteries linger, and the line between fact and the unknown grows razor thin. I'm Sandman, your guide through the hidden corridors of reality. Here, every question awakens a mystery, and every mystery pulls us deeper into the truth concealed in the shadows. Tonight, we step once again into the world where the truth and mystery collide. Well, last time on the ParaReality podcast, when I talked about disclosure on the first part, we began our deep dive into the strange, shifting landscape of UFO disclosure, and we explored the history behind the secrecy from Roswell and Project Blue Book to modern military encounters and the Pentagon programs quietly operating behind the scenes. We looked at congressional hearings that sounded historic, but revealed almost nothing. And we heard from whistleblowers whose testimonies raised more questions than answers. And by the end of episode 1, we found ourselves facing a simple but unsettling problem. There's movement in the conversation, but no progress in the truth. Testimony's been given, footage has been released, programs have been acknowledged, and yet we're left with a government that seems willing to say that, yeah, there's something out there without ever really saying what it is. So tonight, in part 2 of my series on disclosure, I'm going to dive a little deeper, much deeper actually, because every story has two sides, the part we're allowed to see and the part that stays buried. If episode 1 showed us the visible side of the phenomena, the history, the hearings, the emerging voices, then tonight we're stepping into the shadows behind it, the part of the story that operates under classification, behind closed doors, inside secure facilities, and within agencies that don't answer to the public. This is where the real questions begin. Things like we're going to ask are, why does secrecy persist? Who controls the flow of information? Why is the narrative shifting now after decades of denial? And what does the government gain by keeping the truth just out of reach? Because nothing about disclosure, not the timing, not the language, not the hearings, not the slow drip of official statements, is accidental. Someone is managing this conversation. Someone is controlling what gets acknowledged and what doesn't. And someone is deciding how much the public is allowed to know and when. So tonight, we're going to pull back that curtain, or at least that's what we're going to attempt to do. I'm going to try to break down the strategic, political, and psychological reasons behind the secrecy. I'll explore the possibility that disclosure isn't unfolding naturally, but is instead being shaped and guided to maintain control. And together we'll look at where all this might be heading, the risks, the motivations, and the paths forward that could redefine everything we think we know. If episode 1 was about how we got here, then episode 2 is about what happens next. This is the ParaReality podcast. ParaReality is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. For more information or to check out other shows on the network, please visit evergreenpodcast.com.
Broadcast from a secret bunker somewhere outside of Nashville, Tennessee. This is the award-winning podcast, ParaReality.
You know, why now? Why secrecy? Fear, power, or is it something else? Whenever the topic of UFOs or UAP secrecy comes up, there's a question that nearly everyone eventually asks, and that's whether they believe in the phenomena or not. As if the government knows something, why wouldn't they tell us? That's the question, right? It's a fair question to ask. On the surface, transparency seems like the logical path, especially if what we're talking about is a discovery that could reshape science, technology, history, spirituality, economics, and even the understanding of what it means for us to be human. But governments, especially those that are large and complex, these national security driven governments like the United States, well, they don't operate on curiosity. They operate on interest. And by interest, I mean things like strategic interest, political interest, security interest, economic interest, and stability interests. So when we examine the question of secrecy, whether there's several possible explanations that emerge, and none of them exist in isolation. They overlap. They reinforce each other. They create a system where secrecy isn't just preferred, but it becomes necessary. So let's explore the major drivers here. The first thing is strategic advantage. So if the U.S. government or private aerospace contractors working with it recovered material, technology, or biological evidence not made by human hands, then that information would represent the most significant technological advantage in history. We're talking about things like propulsion beyond chemical or jet technology, energy systems beyond combustion or nuclear fusion, materials beyond known metallurgy, navigation beyond human inertial tolerance, physics that challenge relativity and classical mechanics. Even if just one of these breakthroughs is real, secrecy becomes predictable, right? Because whoever understands it first doesn't just win a war. They change the world order. And historically, game-changing technology has never been shared openly until the controlling power benefited from doing so. So the second thing we need to look at is national security stability. There's this other angle, one that's rooted in control, not advantage. So imagine for a minute that the government issued a simple, unambiguous statement. And it's this: we are not alone. Just 3 words. No details, no evidence, no context. Even with nothing else attached, those words alone would disrupt things like religious worldviews, philosophical assumptions, psychological frameworks, political systems, and power hierarchies, not to mention economic stability. Governments know that information can destabilize populations, and historically, the UFO topic has been treated as something that's best contained, which leads to another layer, and that's institutional momentum. Secrecy, once it's stabilized, really does become its own ecosystem. Programs are created, budgets are formed, clearances are implemented, and oversight on the thing fragments, and entire careers and agencies become structured around compartmentalization, and they work in silos almost. And at that point, transparency doesn't just reveal information, it exposes things like who knew, when did they know, how much of our tax dollars was spent on this, and what programs existed without any oversight, and whether laws were broken to maintain this secrecy. Disclosure, in that sense, isn't just a revelation. It's more like an audit. And audits, my friends, create consequences. And that leads us to number 4, public readiness, or at least the perception of it. So for decades, officials justified UFO secrecy by arguing that the public wasn't psychologically ready for confirmation. That idea traces back to reports like the Robertson Panel in 1953 and the Brookings Institute study in the 1960s. Those documents suggested, or at least implied, that sudden confirmation of extraterrestrial intelligence could lead to things like identity crisis, religious conflict, social breakdown, loss of trust in authority. Now, whether or not that's true today is, well, debatable. Polls show the majority of people already believe intelligent life exists somewhere else in the universe, and science acknowledges that it's a statistical possibility. And modern media has kind of normalized this whole idea, but government psychology doesn't adapt quickly. Trust me, as someone who has spent a long time working for the government, and I still do, systems built for secrecy tend to remain secret long after the original justification fades. And then we have the unknown variable. And there's one final reason why secrecy persists, and it may be the most important. They might not fully understand it, right? If technology or intelligence associated with UAPs is like non-human, non-terrestrial, interdimensional, a future human, artificial, or something we haven't even conceptualized yet, then it may exist outside our current scientific framework. Now, governments, they don't oftentimes admit that they're uncertain about things, especially when the uncertainty involves something that's, I don't know, smarter, faster, or more capable than we are. Because uncertainty erodes authority, and authority requires confidence, and confidence requires answers that the government might not have. So the result of this is managed silence. So when we combine all of these elements, strategic advantage, national security, institutional secrecy, perceived public sensitivity, and scientific uncertainty, a pattern emerges here. And the government doesn't hide UAPs because the truth is unbelievable. They hide it because the truth has value. And as long as it has value, whether that's economic, military, political, or psychological, complete transparency is probably unlikely, at least not voluntarily. Think about that. But secrecy can't last forever, right? Especially when the conversation, it's no longer confined to classified rooms and black budget programs, but now it's happening out in the public, on the record, and under oath, which brings us to the next stage of this disclosure debate. And that is, if full transparency isn't the intention, then what is? So Is disclosure already happening, or is it just like controlled theater with hearings, official statements, media coverage, and whistleblower testimony entering the public sphere? Some people believe disclosure is already happening, that it's already underway, that we're witnessing a slow, deliberate unveiling of the truth. Well, at first glance, that interpretation makes a lot of sense. After all, government officials are acknowledging unidentified that craft exists. The military has released this verified footage of unidentified craft. Whistleblowers are testifying on the record about these unidentified craft, and news outlets are covering the topic of UAPs seriously, and public stigma around sightings is starting to fade. But if we look a little more closely, if we examine how information is being released, what's being said, and more importantly, what isn't being said, a different possibility emerges. One that suggests disclosure isn't transparency. It's narrative management. So if the government has made several highly publicized announcements in recent years, statements like, we cannot identify these objects. These craft demonstrate capabilities beyond known technology. We are taking this seriously. On the surface, those statements sound meaningful. But what do they actually tell us? Not origin, not intelligence, not purpose, not possession of material, not research progress, not historical context. Just acknowledgement of mystery. In other words, the government has gone from saying nothing is happening to something is happening, but we can't talk about it. And that shift creates the appearance of progress without revealing anything substantial. So you have here a pattern of what I call minimal disclosure. All right. Let's break down this pattern. Number one, admit the phenomena exist, but provide no details. Number two, allow credible witnesses to speak, but avoid verifying or denying their claims. Number three, release footage, but keep the resolution low and the data on it incomplete. Number four, hold hearings, but issue no subpoenas, no investigations, no evidence requests. And finally, number five, create task forces and programs, but keep the findings classified. At every stage where transparency could occur, the progress stops just short of actual disclosure. It's movement without destination. It's change without substance, and presentation without resolution. So is it controlled conversation, or is it an open inquiry? Well, one of the clearest indicators that the current disclosure climate may be managed rather than organically happening, let's say, is the way that this conversation around is being framed. The government, well, when they make statements about it, they emphasize things like safety, aviation risks, unknown technology, potential adversary capabilities, and national security implications. But rarely, in fact, almost never, do they address the question that most of us are really asking, and that is this intelligence non-human? Is it from somewhere else? Instead, the language remains deliberately ambiguous, just open enough to keep the public interest alive, but closed enough to avoid definitive confirmation. Now, this kind of messaging keeps the public, us, it keeps us engaged, but dependent, never really informed, but it keeps us curious. So why control the narrative? If the government's unwilling to reveal the truth, yet unwilling to deny it at the same time, then the purpose may be expectation management. Controlled disclosure by the government allows the public to acclimate psychologically. It allows the media to normalize the topic. It allows policy to shift gradually and Congress to build administrative structure. Private contractors, it allows them to maintain technological advantage. It transformed a once taboo subject into a regulated space where the government decides who talks, when they talk, what language they use, what evidence is permitted, and what the public is allowed to conclude about all this. So disclosure becomes less about revealing the truth and more about managing how the truth enters society. And there's really, how much pressure is there on the government to reveal more? So another telling sign is that nothing in the current disclosure environment forces the government to provide us, the public, with any kind of additional information. There aren't any legal deadlines. There's no required reporting transparency, no independent oversight, no mandatory evidence release, and no public accountability mechanism. Instead, we get reports with phrasing like insufficient data to draw conclusions. Further analysis is required. Statements that sound responsible, right? But they don't reveal anything. They tell us nothing, nada. And in the absence of accountability, secrecy doesn't erode, it evolves. So what if this is controlled disclosure, not open disclosure? What's the intended outcome? Well, some possibilities include things like desensitization. You make the extraordinary ordinary. Deflection. You shift the focus from historical secrecy to future policy. It could be delay. You buy time for research and reverse engineering. Preparation. So normalize the topic while you still can before you're forced to, right? And it could also be gatekeeping. It could ensure institutions, not us, not the public, remain in control. And notice that none of these outcomes involve the public receiving the full truth. Instead, they ensure that the government stays ahead of the conversation. So now we need to return to something that was asked earlier, but this time with a little bit more context. So if disclosure is happening, why does it feel like nothing is being disclosed? Because maybe what we're witnessing isn't revelation. Maybe it's positioning. Maybe it's a controlled rollout is a narrative rehearsal, a way for the government to say, we've acknowledged this. We never denied it. And that way, when they're pressured in the future, they can go, well, hey, we told you, we said it was real. We never denied this. And in that light, disclosure isn't a truth being revealed. It's a truth being managed carefully, strategically, and deliberately. So let's continue. The public perception, belief, conditioning, and preparedness. Let's talk about it. So if disclosure or something resembling it is unfolding slowly and deliberately, then there's another part of the equation that we need to consider. And that's us, the public, because secrecy doesn't exist in a vacuum, people. For nearly 80 years, the government's handling of UFOs or UAPs, whatever you want to call them, hasn't just been about hiding information. It's also been about shaping how the public thinks about the topic. So to understand the modern landscape of disclosure, we need to look at how public attitudes have shifted, how culture, media, and messaging have helped guide that shift. So it's over the years, it's gone from ridicule to curiosity. So for much of the late 20th century, UFOs occupied a strange place in our society, both widely known and widely dismissed. People believed in them privately, but they didn't talk about them publicly. If you did, you were a weirdo. And sightings were often just whispered about, only talked about in secrecy or in private, or sometimes, a lot of times, not at all. And they damn sure were very little reported, if they were reported at all. Witnesses hesitated because, well, they lacked not because they lacked the conviction, but because they faced mockery. For decades, the dominant public narrative wasn't just that UFOs were not real. It was that believing in them made you, like I said, a weirdo. It made you irrational. But that wasn't an accident. Government panels, including the Robertson panel back in 1953, well, they recommended using ridicule as a tool to discourage public engagement with the UFO topic. And it worked. For a long time, the idea of unidentified craft, UFOs, became like a punchline or a late night talk show gimmick, or like, some sort of trope in science fiction movies. It was these things rather than something worthy of investigation. Now there's a cultural softening, thanks largely in part to the role of the media. Culture, it evolves, and entertainment often leads the shift. Movies, TV shows, books, and video games started exploring the UFO subject, not as nonsense, but as possibility. From movies like Close Encounters of the Third Kind to TV shows like The X-Files, from documentaries to conspiracy forums, the topic slowly transitioned from the fringe, from something that was taboo, to becoming more accepted and intriguing. And by the early 2000s, something very subtle had happened. And that was the idea of extraterrestrial life wasn't so shocking anymore. People weren't asking, could it be real? Instead, they were asking, if it is real, then why aren't we being told? Now, that shift matters because it prepared the public, it prepared us in ways that formal disclosure could not do. So today, multiple surveys by different agencies show a consistent trend, and that's three things. Number one, a majority of Americans believe extraterrestrial life likely exists. Number two, a significant percentage believe the government is hiding information from us. And number three, many people now view UAP encounters as plausible, not something fringe. And when military footage was released to the public in 2017, something really extraordinary happened. People didn't panic. There weren't any kind of, there were no mass protests. The market didn't collapse. There's no psychological breakdown. Most people just simply reacted with, something like, yeah, that makes sense. In fact, a lot of people, myself included, were like, we already knew that. We had already assumed that. And that reaction tells us something important. And that's this. If disclosure is happening slowly, it's because the public has already been socially conditioned to accept the possibility. Not through press briefings, but through culture. and belief no longer depends on permission. So this other shift has now taken place, and this is one that may be making secrecy harder to maintain. And that's this, that the public no longer waits for official validation anymore. Witnesses now share their footage like online immediately after it happens, or sometimes while the sighting is happening. Pilots discuss encounters on podcasts and in interviews with magazines and stuff like that, and on television shows. Information spreads faster than institutions can contain it, and the government no longer controls the narrative 100%. At best these days, it just simply participates in it. So are we prepared for disclosure or prepared for control? Well, here's the important question we need to ask. Is the public finally ready for disclosure because society has matured, or because curiosity has gradually been shaped, softened, and normalized? Were we being prepared or simply acclimated? Because there's a difference, right? Preparation implies collaboration, and acclimation implies management. And when a topic moves from ridicule to fascination to acceptance without full transparency, it suggests someone wanted the public to be comfortable with the idea long before they were willing to discuss it openly. So now we arrive at a pivotal point. If the public believes and the government acknowledges, but the truth remains behind closed doors, the question then becomes, what happens when secrecy can no longer be maintained? And with that question, I got to take a pause for the cause. I will be back very shortly.
You've listened to the stories. You've questioned the truth. Now it's time to wear it. Head over to ParaReality.com and check out the official ParaReality merchandise shop. T-shirts featuring the official podcast logo, the iconic ParaReality all-seeing eye, plus mugs, hats, totes, pillows, stickers, and yes, even something for your pooch. But while you're there, don't stop at the merch. Look a little closer. Dig a little deeper. Somewhere on the site, you'll find the entrance to the secret bunker, the members-only section of ParaReality.com. Inside, the ParaReality top secret files. Real FBI documents on UFOs, aliens, Bigfoot, Adolf Hitler, and more. Plus classified audio. Some of the strangest messages ever left on the secret bunker hotline, and access to a secret podcast side project that's never been released publicly. And here's the best part. It's all absolutely free. Once you're in, don't forget to claim your free ParaReality Podcast Secret Bunker t-shirt. Just make sure you place your order. The truth is out there. The bunker is waiting. Visit ParaReality.com and find what you weren't supposed to.
Welcome back, everybody. So before the break, I asked what happens when secrecy can no longer be maintained, right? Well, now let's talk about paths forward. The way I see it, that we have three possible paths forward, and I'll talk a little bit about their meaning. Okay. So here we are. We have a government that acknowledges this phenomenon, but refuses to clarify it. And we have whistleblowers who speak about it openly, but whose testimony, well, doesn't go anywhere, just leads nowhere. And we have public interest in this topic rising while official transparency remains carefully limited. The stage is shifting, but the proverbial curtain hasn't lifted. So the natural question becomes, where does this go? If the trajectory continues, if secrecy can't hold forever, but transparency still isn't the goal, then there are really only three possible paths ahead. And each one carries a very, very different implication, not just for policy or for science, but for humanity's understanding of itself. So let's take a walk through these. So the first one is controlled disclosure. This is the slow managed rollout, the one that many believe we're already in the middle of. Under this scenario, the government never makes a sudden announcement. There's no live press conference, no breaking news headline that says we are not alone. Instead, the truth emerges gradually in layers. First, you acknowledge the unidentified craft exists. And second, you acknowledge they demonstrate advanced technology. And then later on, you admit some encounters involves intelligently controlled objects. And eventually, you reveal biological evidence, maybe without identifying its origin, though. And then finally, you confirm the intelligence, but on a timeline dictated by national interest and not public curiosity. You see, in controlled disclosure, the public is guided step by step to an inevitable, can't say that, conclusion. They're not shocked. It's not overwhelmed. They're just eased into acceptance. It's orderly and protective and very strategic. And most importantly, the institutions that withheld the truth still maintain control over it. So the second path that we have is forced disclosure. And this is the scenario where truth doesn't come from the government, but to the government. It could be triggered by things like a mass public sighting, an undeniable UFO landing, leaked classified information, international disclosure by another nation, or increasingly non-human action that's beyond human control. Now, in this case, this forced disclosure, secrecy collapses not because someone chose transparency, but because circumstances moved the choice entirely. If this happens, the government response would likely be reactive and not proactive. It would be more like a knee-jerk reaction. There'd be confusion, denials, delays, and eventually acceptance. And unlike controlled disclosure, where institutions stay ahead of the narrative, forced disclosure means that the narrative overtakes them. That loss of control could destabilize political authority, erode trust, and raise uncomfortable questions like, how long have you known? Why didn't you tell us? Who was allowed access and who wasn't? What else have you hidden from us? Forced disclosure, well, it may feel like kind of like an exciting thing to some of us, but politically, economically, and socially, it's really the most volatile path and the one that we really don't want to go down. Path 3 is the perpetual middle ground here. And this may be probably the most unsettling, that disclosure never fully happens, not officially, not publicly, and not clearly. Instead, we remain permanently suspended in ambiguity. We learn that, well, something is out there, but we're never told what it is. Reports about it will continue. Hearings about it will continue. Acronyms about it change. Programs about it shift names. Testimony comes and goes, but full confirmation never arrives. Does that sound kind of familiar? Huh? It does to me. It's exactly what's going on right now as far as I'm concerned. We're still getting congressional UFO hearings. We're still getting reports that these things are out there. Acronyms have changed from UFO to UAP, from ATIP to ARROW. Programs shift names. Like I said, ATIP to ARROW. Testimony comes and goes. All this has happened and is happening, but we still have never got full confirmation. In this scenario, the public, us, we the public, we the people, we become accustomed to the unknown. The extraordinary becomes ordinary, and mystery becomes like nothing more than a background noise. And over time, unanswered questions stop feeling urgent. Instead, they become normal. And in that world, disclosure isn't a single event or a revelation, but it becomes more like a condition, a constant state of almost knowing, a quiet understanding that's suspended just short of confirmation, not because the truth isn't available, but because someone somewhere decided we shouldn't cross that final line. So which path are we on? Well, right now, you could make an argument that we could be on path one, because if you just base it on the controlled language, the selective releases, the lack of follow-up, the absence of accountability, the careful pacing, and the strategic ambiguity, you could make a good argument to say that we're probably on path one. It's a slow, deliberate, carefully crafted drip to inform us, but not acclimate, not the truth, but management. Now, I've made an argument for path three. I'm sure someone can make an argument for path two. That's, like I said, the most volatile one. I don't want to be not going to try and get on that one. But, paths can change, and public pressure, it evolves, and leaks can grow harder to contain. Technology can make secrecy fragile. And history shows no institution remains in control forever. So when the public knows, even without confirmation, at some point, the government's official position might just become irrelevant. Not because they finally reveal the truth, but because the public reaches it without them. They may already be approaching that threshold anyway, because right now we have verified military footage, eyewitness testimony from trained observers, radar-confirmed encounters, government acknowledgement of unknown craft, legislative action forming UAP task force, and whistleblower allegations supported by security clearances. And most people, whether casually or carefully informed, most people now believe there's more to this story than what we're being told. So what happens when belief becomes consensus, even without official confirmation? Well, there are three keys that this shift's already underway. So shift number one, the burden of proof has reversed. For decades, anyone claiming UFOs were real had to prove it, right? Eyewitnesses were questioned, pilots were doubted and ridiculed and made fun of, and scientists avoided the topic to protect their credibility. But today, if someone claims that there's nothing to the UAP phenomenon, they are now the ones expected to justify their position. That reversal is rare, and it's a telling thing. It means public, we no longer see skepticism as the default, but avoidance. And avoidance isn't the position of someone confident in their truth. It's the position of someone protecting their truth. Shift number two, the public narrative no longer belongs to the government. For most of the 20th century, the government controlled the information flow. If something strange appeared in our skies, the public relied on news anchors, military spokespeople, official press releases. And today, the chain of credibility is fractured. Information can originate from basically anywhere: civilian smartphones, airline cockpit recordings, leaked military documents, declassified Freedom of Information Act releases. podcast and alternative media like this one, satellite tracking hobbyists, social media posts seen by millions of people within minutes of it being posted, and the government can't control the conversation. At best, it can attempt to shape it after the fact. Shift number 3, official silence no longer denies the phenomena, it validates it. So there was a time when the government silence just implied that there's nothing out there, and now that same silence implies, well, there's something here and we're just not talking about it. So when testimony goes unchallenged and when claims go uninvestigated, when whistleblowers face no legal correction, the silence becomes part of the narrative. It becomes intentional, measured, strategic, and in some cases, louder than a denial ever could be. So the government may be waiting for the public to demand disclosure, or they may be waiting for a moment when admitting the truth benefits national interest more than hiding it does. But there is a scenario with even greater implications, and that's the one where the government may eventually claim that it's disclosing only after the public already knows. And when that happens, the tone won't be revelatory. It'll sound like justification, like a correction or a reframing, or a final attempt to rewrite history, right? The government could say, like, we've always taken this seriously. We've released everything when the time was right. We did this to protect stability, and we acted responsibly. Public acknowledgement, not of truth, but of control. So the question isn't, will disclosure happening? It's, who will own the narrative when it finally does? Because the first organization to define the truth becomes the authority on it. And right now, the public, the whistleblowers, the scientific community, and the government are all moving toward the same point, but not at the same speed. Hey guys, I'd love to hear from you. Do you have a story, a question, or a topic you'd like me to cover? If so, you can reach me directly by email at sandman@parareality.com. Or for a more personal touch, you can just call the Secret Bunker at 615-461-5001 and leave a message. Just know that by calling, you're giving me permission to feature your voice on the podcast. Again, that number to call is 615-461-5001. You want to stay up to date with all things ParaReality? Then follow me on all major social media platforms. You can find me on Facebook at sandman.parareality, or you can follow me on X, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok by looking for my handle at ParaRealRadio. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel by looking for ParaReality 1. That's ParaReality with the number 1 behind it. And don't forget to visit my website, ParaReality.com. That's where you'll find an archive of all of my past podcast episodes for free. You can also find the latest in paranormal news from all around the world under the Para News section. Your support means everything, whether you buy something from my store or leave me a positive review on whatever podcast app you're listening on. A 3-star or higher review goes a long way in helping this podcast reach new listeners, and I would truly appreciate it. Thank you. All right, welcome back, everybody. So where do we stand now and what's going to come next? So now we've reached the present moment, a crossroads. We aren't in denial anymore, and the conversation has moved far past the era of ridicule and suppression. But we're not in true transparency either. Instead, we're in a space that feels transitional, a kind of holding pattern between acknowledgement and confirmation, a space where the public is aware, the evidence is public, testimony is recorded and it's out there for the public, and there are government entities that exist to investigate these things, but the final answers remain withheld. So where does that leave us? Well, right now we stand on three converging realities. The first is that the phenomenon is real. Regardless of origin, interpretation, or classification, the existence of unidentified aerial phenomena is no longer in question. That part of the debate is over. When military systems track objects with instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic mobility, transmedium movement, no aerodynamic surfaces, no visible propulsion, and when those reports are verified, documented, and acknowledged, the question is no longer if, it's what and who. Second is that institutions are not ready to explain it yet. Whether the reason is strategic advantage, incomplete understanding, national security protocol, internal secrecy, or political calculus, the government is not prepared to give us a full accounting, at least not yet, and maybe not willingly. See, key information remains classified. Key programs remain inaccessible. Key claims remain uninvestigated. And even now, with testimony on record, there aren't any subpoenas being issued. There's no demanded documentation, no legal pressure applied to obtain answers. And this tells us something, people. Disclosure, if it comes, will not come through force. It will come through decision. It'll be a timing choice. It'll be a calculation. And we have finally that the public is no longer waiting for permission. This may be the most important development. The public, us collectively, we've crossed the threshold, not because we were told, but because we've seen enough. There's leaked footage, whistleblower testimony, satellite tracking stuff, civilian recordings, and decades of reports, and all these things combined have created something very powerful that the government doesn't want us to have. And that's independence. You see, belief no longer depends on the government affirmation. Curiosity no longer submits to official silence. And information flow no longer travels just in one direction. In many ways, the government is no longer the gatekeeper of knowledge. It's just one more voice among the many. So, what happens next? Well, my friends, that depends on which force becomes stronger. Institutional control, public demand, further leaks, international pressure, or simply the phenomena itself. If the current pattern continues, we may see more hearings and more reports and more acknowledgement, but we still won't get any answers. If pressure escalates, legal, political, or public pressure, we may see movement towards accountability. And if something dramatic occurs, like a mass sighting or some sort of classified leak that's too large to contain, or maybe even we have direct interaction, then secrecy may not survive the movement. But whatever happens, one thing's certain. We were further into this conversation than any previous generation. That's for sure. This is no longer speculation. This is no longer rumor. This is no longer fringe. It's real. It's documented. It's acknowledged. And yet it remains unresolved. So the final question isn't, is disclosure happening? The real question is, Who gets to define the truth when it finally reaches the surface? Now, as we wrap up part 2 of this series on disclosure, one thing has become clear. The truth about the UAP phenomena isn't just about lights in the sky or unusual craft or unexplained encounters. It's about systems, complex systems that control information, manage perception, and decide what the public is allowed to understand. Now, tonight, we've looked at what drives that secrecy, the strategic advantage of unknown technology, the institutional momentum that keeps classified programs buried, the political risk of admitting things too soon or too late, and the growing reality that the public may no longer need permission to know what already exists. But disclosure, real disclosure, was never going to be a process of things like a press conference or a single dramatic reveal. It was always going to be exactly what we're experiencing now. A slow, uneven, carefully measured shift from denial into acknowledgement, from acknowledgement into ambiguity, and ambiguity into something that looks like transparency but never crosses that final line. And that brings us to the question that sits at the center of this entire discussion. If the government already knows the truth, whatever that truth may be, then what will it take for them to finally share it with us? Will it come from political pressure? Will it come from a leak that's too big to contain? Will it be a sighting that's too public to dismiss? Or is it going to be another nation stepping forward first and acknowledging disclosure? Or will it just simply come from the phenomenon itself, a movement that forces humanity to confront a reality much larger than the one we've been allowed to see? Well, we don't know, at least not yet. But if the walls around this topic, man, they are shifting. The narrative is loosening. And the distance between what the public believes and what the government admits is shrinking a little day by day. The truth may not be here yet, but it's moving, and sooner or later, it's going to arrive. And when it does, the real questions won't be whether we're alone. It won't be whether unidentified craft exists. And it won't be, where do they come from? The real question will be, when the truth finally steps into the light, will we recognize it? And more importantly, will we trust the people who deliver it? Think about it. Thank you for joining me for this 2-part exploration into disclosure. Until next time, make sure you turn on, tune in, and find out. Everyone, I hope that you enjoyed tonight's episode of ParaReality. I'll be back next Friday with episode number 2 of the Midnight Syndicate, so make sure you don't miss it. It'll be available wherever you get your podcast, 8 o'clock p.m. Central Standard U.S. Time, episode 2 of Midnight Syndicate. Everyone, I hope that this podcast opens up your mind to new ways of thinking, expands your consciousness, and produces a change in the way you see the world. If you wish to change, you must lift the veil of ignorance that has been cast over your eyes. Only then will you see the true power of the universe. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode. I hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you again next week.
If you wish to change, you must first lift the veil of ignorance that has been cast over your eyes. Only then will you see the true power of the universe.